intro, and we'll try and get started. Boy, what a great crowd, and thank you everyone again for your patience. Really excited to conclude our series of Phillips of Seminary at College Hill. It's been a really exciting and wonderful series. Every speaker has been challenging and interesting, and we are ending today with Professor Warren Carter. He is a Kiwi, born in New Zealand, and in the category of It's a Small World, he's the John G., my father's scholar, named by the Southwest, I don't know the full organization.
Commission on Religious Studies.
Something, yes, in 2014, so really very cool. An exciting presentation today on John the Baptist. It's a really sort of a cultural survey and a deep dive into some Caravaggio, and so a lot of fun stuff. So with that, welcome Professor Carter.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Pleasure to be here. So we need to share screen now?
Yes, let's try to share screen.
Okay. So everybody hold your breath.
That's right.
Just don't breathe.
Light the candles and throw the salt.
That's for ghosts.
It is sharing.
Yeah, but it's not moving. Hang on.
Okay.
How do that? Ah, it's moving.
Hooray.
Look at that. It works. Okay, you can breathe again now. Well, pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you for this opportunity. And as John says, this is the end of the 7-week partnership between College Hill and Phillips, and it's good to be part of that. So I want to explain this focus on John the Baptist, which I called A Spirited Life. And you can see how desperate I am to make a connection with Pentecost. So I wanted to do something in relation to Pentecost, but I thought, well, the Acts chapter 2 story, I'm going to talk about it in the service, so I didn't think there was any need to run the sermon twice. Right? No need for that. So I thought about Paul, I thought about the Gospel of John, where we have references to the role of the Spirit. And then I thought about John the Baptist, who hardly ever figures in any connection to the Spirit at all. But John has one of the few references in the Gospels to the Spirit. So, okay, there we go.
There we go.
So, I'm going to think particularly about Mark's Gospel, because although we have a number of traditions about John across the 4 Gospels, in Mark's Gospel there are only 2 passages that refer to John the Baptist. One has to do with his initial preaching, which has a reference to the Spirit, and then the other reference has to do with his death, which is the much more dramatic and interesting story. So let's look at this passage first of all, where he does his preaching, and we'll do that pretty briefly, and then we'll spend most of the time on the passage concerning John's death, right? So you can see how desperate I was to make a connection with Pentecost and then to move along. All right? So I trust we can be forgiven for that. So, you know this material about John. He's even got a Lego figure, I mean. So he must have some popular notoriety. Weird clothing and weird diet, as you can see. But the main role, of course, for John in announcing repentance in his baptism is to be a preparer for Jesus. And so when he baptizes Jesus, the Spirit comes upon Jesus, and John is said to comment, I baptize with water, but he will baptize with the Holy Spirit. Now that's really interesting, because in the rest of Mark's Gospel, there's almost no reference to the Holy Spirit at all. In the whole of the rest of Mark's Gospel. When the word spirit or spirits is used, mostly in Mark's Gospel, it refers to evil spirits. All right? But there are at least 2 passages where there's a reference to the role of the Spirit with believers. One is the warning that if you blaspheme against the Spirit, then that's unforgivable. There's no way back from that. And the other reference is that in difficult circumstances, the Spirit will give you the words to speak. Okay? So there's an assumption in all of that, that somehow the Spirit is active with believers, with Jesus' followers. The Spirit is present. But there's no actual passage in the Gospel where, say in John's Gospel, Jesus breathes on the followers and they receive the Spirit. There's nothing like that in Mark's Gospel. There's no passage where Jesus dispenses or shares or baptizes with the Spirit at all. So there's an assumption that believers, followers do have the Spirit, but how they get it is not something that Mark's Gospel engages at all. Of course, in the Pentecost story in Acts chapter 2, that's made very explicit how the Spirit is given. But in Mark's Gospel, we don't have that sort of connection made. So, that's that passage. That's about as much as we can do with it in terms of John's reference to Jesus baptizing with the Spirit, which just sort of falls out of consideration through the rest of Mark's story. But the other big scene that we get concerning John the Baptist in Mark's Gospel is the death scene, which has enticed and engaged and provoked followers interpreters for a very long time. You can do it. Come on. You can do it. Yes. So, in the chapel in the Basilica of St. Sylvester in Rome, you can actually see the head of John the Baptist, if you are so inclined. So, as it says at the bottom there, caput, which is actually Latin for the head. We get it in English, of course, in the word capital, for example. The head of something. So the head of John the Baptist, the precursor of the Lord. Now, of course, there are all sorts of relics all over Christendom for all sorts of figures. So who knows whether this is actually John's head or not? Nobody knows. I mean, probably in a whole bunch of other chapels, there are also the heads of John the Baptist. So, how many did he have? Who knows? But anyway, I just thought you'd like to know. Okay, so, yes, it's interesting if nothing else. All right, so here's the account of the death of John the Baptist. So I'll read it because, this is the biggest print I could get on one slide, right? So I'll read it. So for Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for Herod had married her. John had been telling Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him. Not all publicity is good publicity. But she could not kill him, for Herod feared John, knowing he was a righteous and holy man, and so Herod protected him. But when Herod heard him, he was greatly perplexed, yet he liked to listen to John. A bit of confusion there. An opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. So this is Herod Antipas. So this is the son of so-called Herod the Great, right? The guy who kills the infants of Bethlehem. Okay? So this is his son who's given the territory of Galilee and Perea by the Romans to be the ruler. Okay? So this is the next generation. So do the bloodlines improve with time or not? Yes. So we have a birthday banquet. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. The king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." He solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask, I will give you, even half my kingdom." She went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask for?" This is the aforementioned carrying a grudge mother. She replied, "The head of John the Baptizer." Immediately she, the daughter, rushed back to the king and requested, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptizer on a platter." Now, mother did not ask for it on a platter. The daughter has added that touching little detail. The king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, who of course had witnessed this silly promise, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter, gave it to the girl gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Well, it's a whole lot more of a story than I'll baptize with water and Jesus will baptize with the Spirit, right? They've got half a verse. We get, 14 or so verses here. All right, let's try the excitement of changing screen. All right, so let's play the blame game, because that's what interpreters have done with this scene for the last 2,000 years. They've played the blame game. Who's most responsible for John's death? There are 5 candidates. There's plenty of blame to go around, and we don't need to take a vote at the end. But let's just work it out. Whose fault is it? Another excitement. Here we go. Here's the first candidate. It's John's fault. John gets himself into this mess because he says to Herod, quoting Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, "It is not lawful for you to marry your brother's wife." Now, think about the power dynamic here. This may not be the smartest thing that a prophet or a spokesman like John has ever said to someone in power, such as Herod. Herod actually was never actually called a king, but I'm using the language because that's what the passage refers to him as. You know, we've got this sort of notion that floats around of speaking truth to power. And sometimes it's sort of presented as a very sort of romantic, noble thing to do. But if you're going to speak truth to power, then often power strikes back. Right? And so, a prophet does what a prophet has to do, but there are consequences when you speak truth to power. So maybe it's John's fault. That's candidate number 1. Here's the excitement again. So here's candidate number 2. Herodias, the wife, bearing a grudge because John has criticized her marriage. She's finally got to marry the top dog. And so now this guy's criticizing her, and she is not amused. Not amused at all. And so bears a grudge and wants John removed, which means his head separated from the rest of his body. She wants John out of the way. So her motive is revenge. She's hurt, she's angered. Can I use theological language?
Yeah.
She's pissed off. And so she wants to take revenge for the criticism, and she's going to get his life. Third candidate. It's the daughter's fault. Why? Well, she dances pleasingly. She pleases the king and the guests. Now, here's a massive point of disagreement of interpretation of this scene. How old is this daughter? That's the key question. Because what sort of pleasing does she do? Is she a cute 5, 6, 7-year-old who dances around and stepfather says, "Oh, isn't that lovely"? Is she a cute 5, 6, 7-year-old? Or is she a teenager or older who dances in a very provocative and sexy manner and pleases the king and the guests? We don't know. But interpreters go in each direction. She's innocent, she's cute, she's sweet, it's all okay. Or she's very provocative and very sexy, and she causes the big problem here by getting Herod a little too excited. Right? Now, that's a huge decision to make in terms of the interpretation of the scene. and interpreters go in both directions. We simply don't know from the Greek word how old this child is. So interpreters fill in the gap, which is what always happens. And some go the more innocent way, some go the more sexy way in terms of her role. So she dances pleasingly, pleases the king. What does that mean? Well, we don't know for sure. Anyway, eventually she goes and asks Mum, what should I do now that Herod has offered me anything I want? And Mum says, well, how about the head of John the Baptist? So off she trots to do Mum's will. And again, folks have argued about this. Does she trot off and do Mum's will because she's a nice little 6-year-old? She always does what Mum says. Or is she taking her own agency and saying, yeah, I don't like that creep either. He criticised my mum, so I'm going to get rid of him too. How much collusion does she have in this act? If she's a 5, 6, 7-year-old, not much. If she's older, quite a lot. So she's a candidate, usually for those who want to see her as an older woman who has been provocative in the party. Fourth candidate, well, we've got the courtiers and the officers who are invited to Herod's birthday party. They are present. They are pleased as well. But when Herod says, I'll give you whatever you want, up to half of my kingdom, one of the advisors should have popped up and said, beloved, esteemed king, you cannot do that. Because it's not your kingdom to give away. The Romans have appointed you. It's up to the Romans to decide who has what percentage of the kingdom. And today, you have it. So sit down, be quiet, don't make silly promises. You know, contemporary analogy, don't tweet at 3 in the morning. So, the courtiers, the officers, the leaders have some responsibility here, that they don't stop this rash promise that Herod makes. Whether he's thinking with the wrong part of his anatomy, who knows? And the fifth candidate, it's Herod's fault. He married Herodias without concern for the Levitical law, which said marrying your brother's wife is forbidden. He's pleased by the dance, so we're back to however we make sense of that. But he makes this rash oath, and then he decides he has to keep his word. A little bit of mixed morality here, you know. I promise something really stupid, but I'll keep my word because somehow that will make me honourable. Yeah, right. So he keeps his word even though he likes John. And he liked to hear John preach, although he found it a little disturbing. Bit of a mixed up dude here. Anyway, he acts contrary to his conscience, uses his political power to take John out. So, we have these 5 candidates. Whose fault is it? Well, John contributes something. Herodias is all PO'd about it. The daughter, maybe, maybe not, depending on how we interpret her age and the nature of the dance. The courtiers, the officers, the leaders of Galilee, who are all here for the birthday party, and Herod's fault as well. So, 5 candidates. Does anybody want to back one of these horses, or do we just want to agree on all 5 and leave it at that and move along? Anyone got a favourite? Herod. Stupid Herod. Rash Herod. Confused Herod, right? I mean, he kind of likes John, but he backs himself into a corner well and truly with his rash promise.
Mark doesn't name the daughter.
Right.
Which gospel names the daughter?
I actually think it's the Jewish historian Josephus who names the daughter. And there's further confusion there because there's also a daughter called Herodias. Not just a wife, a daughter as well. So there's some confusion in the traditions about where the name comes from. So I've simply used Salome as a convenient name to do so. Yeah, but
Can we assume that Philip is dead? Because if,
no, we can't assume. We don't know. We've got to understand, and I'm just the reporter at this stage, we've got to understand that in the ancient world, marriage is frequently about alliances. And reporting, women are usually sort of the bartered commodity in making those alliances. So whatever is happening behind the scene, and we really don't know, but for Herod, there is some advantage to steal Philip's wife from Philip. And so it depowers Philip to some extent for Herod to steal it.
according to the Jewish law, if Philip was dead, then it would be Herod's obligation to take his brother.
Well, for those who followed
Yeah.
that whole system of,
Yeah.
of passing the wife to the next brother. But we can't assume he's dead. Yeah. So it's probably a power play on Herod's part. The politics of the Herodians was particularly grubby in the first century. Grubby is a good word. Particularly grubby and scandalous. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on. Yeah. No one want to argue for anybody else?
I'm gonna argue for Herod, but for Herod's action, he wouldn't have the story.
He wouldn't be in this predicament.
Yeah.
Okay. So Herod is getting the votes at the moment. Okay. Yeah.
No, I guess I'll argue for number 4.
Uh-huh.
Part of the reason for it is that a generation later, and that's a kind of exaggeration, people were unable to execute Paul. In Jesus, they're unable to execute Jesus. They had to get a second opinion or they had to take him before.
Yeah, they had to. Pilate was the only one who had the power to execute.
But this particular Herod's father did all kinds of terrible things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And somewhere along the line, leaders of Galilee took away the power of execution and said that orders of execution had to be reviewed by various legal entities, and you just couldn't go out and do it on a whim anymore.
Yeah, so nobody stands up to Herod. Nobody says to him, you shot your mouth off, maybe you had a little too much to drink, or maybe you got affected by the dancing in the wrong way, I don't know. But nobody, these advisors, courtiers, officers, they're there to protect him, in a sense. They're there to advise him. And nobody does any advising for whatever reason. And maybe they'd learned that he wouldn't listen anyway. I don't know. But they have this role as well. All right. So we've got at least 5 candidates, and we've got our favourites, and that's all good and true. Now, what I want to do is this. I want to take now a quick look through the last 2,000 years. What time do we have to finish, John?
An hour, so 10:30.
So about 10:30?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we have a little cushion.
Yeah, okay. So we can do a couple of thousand years in 30 minutes. It's not going to be a problem. So what's interesting about this scene is the way that it has attracted the interest of interpreters across the last 2,000 years. The numbers of paintings of John's death is enormous. So that's one area of focus, and I want to look at one painting in particular. And secondly, the ways of interpreting the dancing daughter have been prolific as well across 2,000 years. And I want to look at a couple of examples of different presentations. Okay? So we're sort of changing direction now in terms of what sort of meanings have folks made of this scene. And these two areas, the actual death of John and the role of the dancing daughter, are the two biggies across the last 2,000 years. I mean, there aren't a ton of paintings of Herodias all gnarly and revengeful, right? There just aren't a bunch of those sorts of paintings. There aren't a bunch of paintings of the courtiers sitting around looking the other way, right? But there are a ton of paintings of John being executed and various presentations of the dancing daughter, okay? So, in the time that we have, let's have a look at how this goes. And here's the first painting that I want to look at, this very famous painting of Caravaggio's from early in the 1600s. And I put a copy of these on the sheet. Could we just send those around? So that, we'll flip back and forward on the screen. Thank you, if we could send them around. So that you can keep it in view, because we'll have a look at it in a little bit of detail. This is a very famous painting from Caravaggio. I hope I made enough copies. We might have to do the Christian thing and share.
What?
Yeah, I know, sorry. I think there should just about be enough.
I've got mine.
Okay, we're doing all right? Okay. All right. So here's Caravaggio's painting from 1608. It was done for the Cathedral of John the Baptist on the island of Malta. A big cathedral dedicated to John the Baptist had been built and finished about the 1580s. And Caravaggio was commissioned to do this painting in honour of John the Baptist. It's one of Caravaggio's biggest paintings. It's the only painting in which he actually signed his name on the painting. Has anyone seen it? Anyone seen it in the cathedral in Malta? Okay. All right. Sometimes folks have. All right, so let's just get some basic information about it. So I said painted on Malta for St. John's Cathedral. It's very big, 12 foot by 17 foot. So I didn't measure along the wall there, but it would be much the size of the wall over here. It's big. It's quite dark as well, and on the screen I've lightened it just a little so that it's a little easier to see. But it's quite a dark painting. The characters are larger than life, and it's set in a prison, I suppose in a dungeon of a prison. It's a big space with this parade of characters that are involved in the execution. And most of those characters are framed by an arch, I think, that you can see there on the designation on the left-hand side of the painting. So what have we got here? We've got 7 characters. We've got Salome carrying the platter. We've got next to her an older woman, and the identification of this woman has perplexed interpreters. Some folks have wondered whether it's Herodias. Some folks have wondered whether it's the daughter's maid who is with her. Then we have the jailer. Then we have the executioner. On the ground we have John, and looking out the barred windows we have 2 other prisoners who I guess are waiting their own particular fate. So you can see the arch that frames most of the action on the left-hand side of the painting, right? So here's the arch, and here's Salome with the platter. Here's this other woman. Here's the jailer, and he's got keys here hanging off his belt. Here's the executioner, and here's John on the ground. Now we can have a look in a little more detail at parts of this scene. Okay, so here are the 4 characters who are gathered, surrounded by the arch. So zeroing in on Salome holding the platter. And so that, of course, is one identification of the daughter. But interpreters also note, hold your breath, yes. Interpreters also note that she has very white arms in the painting. And so a number of interpreters draw the conclusion that this is part of her elite status. She's not a sun-tanned girl. She hasn't been working in the fields or anything like that. She is not a low-status person. She's the inside person. And she is carrying out Herod's wish that she collect John's head. She's modestly attired. She's not sexy in her presentation. But you can see that she's presented here probably what we would call as a teenager. She's not presented as a 6 or 7 year old. Caravaggio's interpretation. So you can see which way he is going in that debate. Her face is very focused. She doesn't shrink from the task. She's not looking away. She's very much concentrated on getting John's head on her platter for mother. All right, so moving then to the second character, this woman here. You can see that she's got her hands over her ears. Not her hands over her eyes, but her hands over her ears. And interpreters make the comment that, the sight of what is happening is very obvious. But there's also a dimension of sound to what is happening in John's execution. And she does not want to hear. So interpreters say things like she's appalled, she's contrite. Is this Herodias? If so, then she would be contrite and appalled. And if so, that would be Caravaggio's interpretation of the scene, because there's nothing in the Mark scene to say that she regrets for half a second what she set in motion. She's actually very pleased that it's accomplished. If it is Herodias, then this would be Caravaggio's interpretation. Most interpreters don't think it is Caravaggio. They think it's the daughter's maid. She's not dressed in elite garb, but she's here with the daughter. She's horrified. She shrinks from, she recoils from what is happening. And as I mentioned, the hands over the ears, not her eyes. The spectacle speaks for itself, the horror of the scene. But there's also an auditory dimension to it. That, of course, in a painting, you can't make the paint squeal, But you can depict a character with her hands over her ears, not wanting to hear the sounds of the death itself. Okay. She is also looking down, but she's not quite in the same. The daughter's eyesight goes right down to John's head. Her eyesight comes right down to the ground. Part of the recoiling from what we have. All right, the next character then, I've just been told that my internet connection is unstable, so I'll take that personally. Since it did say your. Here's the jailer, and he has these keys off his belt, representing his control here. So he's sort of the representative of Herod's authority. He's carrying out Herod's will, supervising it, against this disruptive critic, John. So he's very attentive to the scene. He's pointing to the soldier to get on with the task. But there's another piece to this, and it's a little nasty. The jailer is presented in terms of Turkish ethnicity. And we have a conventional understanding of Turks, from a particular perspective, as barbarous, as brutal, as infidels, right? So we've got a Christian-Muslim thing going on here. And so he, of course, would be stereotypically the jailer, happy to trade in barbarous things, happy to kill people regardless of what they're doing, especially faithful prophets like John, good Christian folks like John. He's happy to kill, using, of course, anachronistic terms, right? But that's Caravaggio's perspective. So he's the antithesis of the maid who is recoiling in horror with her hands over her ears, hating this scene. Here's the jailer apparently kind of enjoying it because he's this barbarous, horrible Turk in Caravaggio's perspective. Christians have done nothing else very well but prejudice and hate, etc., etc. We have a marvellous tradition. So then, of course, we move next to the soldier who has one hand on John's head. There's a sword here on the ground. There's already blood coming from John's throat, sorry to be graphic, and behind his back he has a knife. He's also presented largely unclothed, and you can tell he's a big, muscular, burly sort of character, right? He's got this physical power and domination. Impressive physique. John's on the ground. The sword is on the ground and John's bleeding, but with the knife behind his back, clearly the task isn't finished yet. And so some interpreters have argued that the executioner has botched the job. You know, it's going to take several goes to do this. And that in itself is its own interpretation. But he's reaching for the knife or the dagger behind his back. Now I have the eternal circle circling and we are connecting, apparently. I don't know to what. But, all right, so let's move to John on the ground here, totally being dominated, obviously, in the execution. So you can see the close-up. The executioner's hand is on his head, holding him down. Here's the sword. Here's the blood coming from John's throat. And over here, you can see where I'm pointing, there's what looks like a sheepskin rug. Looks like a sheepskin underneath John, which has some dimensions of sacrifice to it.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. I'm still told that my connection is unstable. It's got the personal pronoun there. It's mine. So here's John prostrate on the ground. He's bound with his hands behind his back. In the process of dying, the sword has not decapitated him, but has slit his throat. And the blood on the ground here, and I think we'll see this in the next slide, here is where Caravaggio's signature is placed. And so a number of interpreters have argued that this is sort of Caravaggio doing, what's the right word, propitiation, doing atonement for his own sinful existence. I mean, Caravaggio was not a saint in his life. And so some have argued that he's sort of identifying with the sacrifice that John is making because it anticipates Jesus' death and Jesus' sacrifice, the alignment of John and Jesus. There's much violence, there's horror here in the scene. Folks have argued, does Caravaggio see any sort of redemption here in this scene, or is it just a total defeat of John and it's Herod's victory? And some interpreters have said, well, I think there are at least two signs of sort of redemption. You notice that John's cloak is red, the sign of the martyr in Christian icons and in Christian paintings. And of course, to be a martyr, and this will sound very strange to us, is the height of blessing, right? This is the height of recognizing faithfulness, to be martyred for one's faithfulness. And so some have argued that although this looks like, a terrible, bloody execution, defeat of John. It isn't. That for Caravaggio, it's a martyrdom. It's a glorious thing. It's a blessed thing that John has been faithful. And the other sign that people talk to is refer to is the look on John's face, which is peaceful. It's not agonized. It's not contorted and twisted. It's the peaceful face of a saint, one who is entering into divine heavenly glory through martyrdom. I don't think we understand martyrdom in quite those terms these days, but at times in our history, martyrdom has been the pinnacle of absolute faithfulness, and so Caravaggio seems to be presenting John in those terms. You'll notice, of course, that in Mark's Gospel, there's no reference to John the Baptist being a martyr. That whole worldview isn't even in Mark's telling of the story, right? There's no attention to how wonderful John is, and he's being exalted into the heavens, and he's been as faithful could be. That's not in Mark's story. But by this evoking with the red cloth, this notion of martyrdom, Caravaggio interprets it in that particular way. Here's a close-up, and you can see Caravaggio's signature here by the blood. The peaceful expression on John's face. Again, it's not contorted in horror and pain, but this is entry to the divine presence. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, we shouldn't forget these guys. So on the right-hand side, we have the two prisoners behind bars who have the pleasure of watching this spectacle. And of course, in Mark's story, there aren't any prisoners watching. So again, Caravaggio has introduced this particular element to the story. There are lots and lots of these sorts of paintings, although I don't think they have. I'm going to move this along. Oh yes, they don't have quite the dramatic presentation of Caravaggio. But just to mention this one thing, look who's missing from the scene. We've got 7 characters here, but Herod is missing. Herod is not present in the scene. He's probably drinking his whatever upstairs with celebrating his misuse of power. All right, now, there are lots of these sorts of images. How are we doing for time? I'll flick through this pretty quickly, just so that you can sort of get a comparison of the way that Caravaggio has really staged this scene right at the moment of death. John is dying in the picture. He hasn't been killed yet, but he's right in that process. So in this scene, he's about to die. So we have the sword that's about to remove his head. In this scene, his head has been removed. Yeah, charming, isn't it? Sorry. His head has been removed and it's already on the platter. Caravaggio's right at that moment of his death. Very stylized, medieval. Here is John's head on the platter. It's all nice and neat and not too bloody. This is another Caravaggio with the head on the platter. We could talk about all of those, but just because of time, I want to get to the second part of this. All right. So, Salome's role in all of this. This is the other big area that interpreters, artists, dramatists, playwrights have focused on and have presented her in different ways. So what I want to do is just very briefly go through 3 phases of her presentation. The first, the early church fathers beat up on her terribly. She is the absolute horrible villain in much interpretation in the early church, and we'll read a couple of extracts. Secondly, when we get to the Renaissance, she becomes a whole lot more innocent, almost virginal in her dancing. She's nice, she's not naughty in those interpretations. And then, in the late 19th and 20th century, she gets celebrated for her sensuality and her sexuality. Not condemned, as with the early church writings, but celebrated. She's a woman of power. She's a woman of agency. She uses what she's got. And it's celebrated. In some paintings, we'll look at one of those. Oscar Wilde's play of Salome in 1893, which celebrated her, for example. And Richard Strauss's opera in 1905, where she actually ends up kissing the head of John the Baptist as part of sort of the celebration of her victory. She's not being manipulated, she's an agent, and she's using what she's got to take John down. And then we'll end up by looking at a particularly graphic painting from Pierre Bonnot. All right, so let's go back and trace this through. How are we doing for time? Yep, we can do this. 7 minutes, we've got it. All right, so her dancing. The male interpreters, the church fathers, they are male interpreters, are much intrigued by this dancing. They present her as a seductress and so condemn her for misusing her sexuality. All right, so here's John Chrysostom from the 4th century. Big noise in the early church, 4th century. We have a lot of Chrysostom's writings. Where there is dance, there the devil is involved also. God gave us feet, not for dancing, but that we might walk in the right way. Not to jump like camels, but that we might form the choral dance with the angels. So that there actually is a right sort of dancing with the angels. But don't leap around like camels.
See the picture.
So, sorry, I didn't hear that. Was that
They're
there?
not muted.
Okay. All right. Here's another example of the same sort of thing. This is from Ambrose, 4th century, Bishop of Milan. In her dance, now look what he's doing to Mark's story. In her dance, there is teasing flirtation, neck twisting, flowing hair. Small wonder that the next step would be a crime against the deity. For how can modesty exist where there is immodesty, shouting, noise-making? See what he's doing to Mark's story. I mean, there's not a reference in Mark to neck twisting. However one does that, I don't know. And here's the best one of the lot. Theophanes Ceremaias from the 12th century. She danced in a frenzy, like a bacchanal, shook her hair, turned shamelessly, stretched out her arms, bared her breasts, kicked her feet high one after the other, uncovered herself in fast bodily movements, and perhaps even showed something of what is unmentionable. With an indecent look, she attracted the attention of all who were present, and with all sorts of movements, she shocked the thoughts of the viewers.
He's got a good imagination.
Doesn't he have a wonderful imagination?
I think he enjoyed himself.
I was going to say, what sort of fantasy is going on for Brother Ceremaias at this point? But you can see the vilification of the daughter and the absolute absenting of any responsibility of the males. No responsibility at all. It's all her fault. So then it changes, and for the better. In the Renaissance, we have a number of paintings where she's not presented in any of these sorts of terms. She's presented much more innocently, and there's much less censure on her. As I said, she's not naughty, but now she's nice. She has some power, but she's not just this sort of horrible, terrible, oversexed person who's causing havoc wherever she goes. So here, this is Gondaio's painting from the 15th century. here she is dancing. And you can see that she's decorously attired. You know, she's not half naked. She's not doing anything with her neck. She's not kicking her legs in the air. She hasn't exposed her breasts. I mean, nothing, right? It's much more dignified. And it's much more about her beauty, not her sexuality. Here's another one, Filippo Lippi from, again, the 15th century. Here she is, in white, very virginal. And again, she's covered from neck to toe. You know, the rest of the folks, some of them not even paying attention. She's hardly got them twisted around her little finger or her bent neck or whatever, right? I mean, she hasn't got any of that. She's hardly not even noticed. And Herod, if this is Herod, he's looking the other way. So she's much more innocent. Here's a close-up of that, and you can see the same sort of detail. I mean, very virginal, very proper, very appropriate. Again, an older woman, not a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old girl. But even as an older girl, woman, teenager, whatever language you want to use, she's not being the brazen hussy of Sarah Myers' imagination. Very appropriate. She has much more agency. We'll just skip this next one just because of time. We'll skip that. But then we get to the 19th and 20th centuries, where now her sexuality and sensuality come back into focus, but without the condemnation of those early church fathers, but much more a celebration of it rather than a condemnation of it. So Oscar Wilde's play from 1893, she's central. The play's actually called Salome, so she's at the centre of the scene. It's not John the Baptist. She's at the centre. She has a passion for John the Baptist, which is interesting. And at the end of the play, she actually kisses his head on the lips. So she's in love with, or she's in lust with, John the Baptist. And it's not condemned in the way of the early church fathers. Then Herod kills her, I should mention that. Clearly didn't like that, okay. Richard Strauss's opera, Salome, also in 1905, which again sort of celebrates this lustful sensuality. Personally, I'm not a fan of Richard Strauss, sorry to admit, but if you are, then God bless you. And
Tulsa Opera did that a year ago.
yeah, right. It was very recent. Yes.
For no really good reason, I'm kind of startled by the references to John being a Christian because he predates Jesus' ministry and being a martyr.
Yeah. Now, that's Caravaggio's perspective.
Is it?
It's not a historical perspective. I mean, John was not a Christian historically, right? But it's Caravaggio from the 17th century aligning John with Jesus and aligning both of them on the Christian side of any divide in history. So it's Caravaggio who's doing that. It's not me who's doing it, and it's certainly not the gospel that's doing it. But that's Caravaggio's perspective. And it works for him because he could make the jailer into this horrible Turkish Muslim, right? Who's full of barbarism and likes to kill and all the rest of it, whereas John's the poor suffering Christian martyr at the hands of such horrible people, right? So it works for him ideologically. It's fueled by Christian intolerance and Christian hate, of which we have a massively long tradition. That's what's fueling it. So it's anachronistically all over the place, wrong. But ideologically, it suits what Caravaggio is trying to do. All right, finally, how are we doing? Yep, we're right on. Okay, so finally, this painting, which kind of sums up the development from the late 19th and early 20th century. So this is Pierre Bonnot's painting of Salome the victor. And she's celebrated. She's not condemned. She's celebrated. She's the seductress, you can tell from her lack of attire. Her hand on John's head dominant. She has accomplished his death. And on the floor,
Yeah.
notice, we have a tiger and a tiger skin. She's the feline predator. She has taken John down, and it's not condemned. You can imagine what Ceremias would do with this, right? I mean, he'd have conniptions left, right, and centre over this. But, 2,000 years later, for Bonneau, this is a celebration of her role and her sensuality, that she is liberated from the church's censure.
Is that a bird on her head?
It's a hat. I don't know exactly what this is, I don't know, it just looks like a sort of a fancy 1920s hat to me. And I don't have a close-up of it, so I can't tell. But maybe it is, I don't know. Yeah, because we had a thing for feathers, didn't we? So, well, some people had a thing for feathers. All right. So, yeah, that's just to say that's the movement that we just moved through. And hold on, back. Sorry, it went one too many. So here's the movement. Again, the very virginal Renaissance figure, while John's getting beheaded. Notice in his posture of piety here, through to Bonneau's painting there. Last thing to comment on, in Mark's Gospel, straight after this scene, this birthday party scene, this death of John scene, straight after it, we have another banquet. We have another meal scene. And it's the feeding of the 5,000 with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. We've got a contrast of different sorts of meals. In one meal, we've got this execution of John the prophet. In one meal, we've got this supposed victory of Herod's tyranny and oppression and domination. And then in the very next scene, we have Jesus feeding the 5,000, those who lack food, giving them what they need, ensuring life rather than death. Now, I'm told that there are such things on TV as soap operas. I have no experience of this personally. I'm just told. And I'm told that soap operas work by changing scenes. You have one 7-second scene and it ends up with someone staring at someone, and then you have a new scene. That's the sort of thing that's happening here in Mark chapter 6. This horrendous, horrible scene with John the Baptist's death, and then immediately a contrasting scene of life-giving power rather than death-bringing power that's juxtaposed in the gospel. An unknown error has occurred. I don't know if that's the commentary on the whole session. I don't know, but I enjoyed it, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
We got there.
Thank you, we did.
We got there. Thanks for all your messing with it. I really appreciate it.
My goodness, this was wonderful. Challenge.